My name is Alex Baug. I am the Vice President of Boulder Flycasters, and welcome to our February meeting. Great, if we could get the next slide, please. So, what is Trout Unlimited? We are primarily a cold water conservation volunteer organization. This is all of our chapter info up here, if you care to contact us. With Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, our email, info for becoming a member if you're not already. I imagine many of you are, thank you. And if you're interested in getting involved or volunteering your time, feel free to just talk to pretty much anybody here who is a member, and we can help get you hooked up with something that you're interested in. We also have a supporting membership program. In exchange for $50 annually, you'll receive 10% off from our wonderful partners at Rocky Mountain Anglers and Front Range Anglers. Big thank you to both of them for their continued support. It means a lot. So here are a couple of local events we've got going on at Rocky Mountain Flycasters and Front Range Anglers. At RMA, we have Bugs and Brews coming up on February 10th. And that's here at Upslope. And then at Front Range Anglers, at their shop, they'll have a winter fly tying seminar series with Barbara and Mark Luneau. Are they here? I don't see them.
No, not tonight.
Not tonight, but they'll be at this event. This evening, we have Anders Halverson presenting on his book, An Entirely Synthetic Fish, and I'm going to hand this off to Don. Oh, sorry. Continuing, handing this off to Don to introduce Anders. Thanks, Don.
Hey everyone, can you hear me all right? Listening? Thanks for coming out tonight. Appreciate it. Faces, good to see. My pleasure to introduce our guest speaker tonight, Anders Halverson. Anders grew up in Colorado fishing for rainbow trout. After getting in college, he bumped around Colorado and Idaho, working as a river guide, ski instructor, and a newspaper reporter. As a newspaper reporter, he returned to school and did a PhD from Yale University in ecology and evolutionary biology. After he completed his PhD in 2005, he got a grant from the National Science Foundation to write a book on the history of freshwater fishery management at the Center for the American West at CU in Boulder. And the result of that was this book, An Entirely Synthetic Fish, which we're going to talk about tonight. Now, if you read this, it's really fascinating. You know, you kind of shake your head sometimes and think, the hell did they think about back then? But really full of really great information, really a picture. So if you haven't read it, it's really a great read. Andrew now lives in Denver. His wife and kids and his dog, and works in the consulting world on sustainability and climate change. So that I'll be welcome, Anders.
Thank you, everybody. Sure.
You're good.
Should I try without the microphone? Let me try without.
Okay, can you hear me now? Yes.
Okay, I'll talk really loud. Can we turn this off?
Yeah.
Turn off the amplifier so we don't get the echo.
Let's just turn off this.
Okay, so thank you, Don, for that introduction. And you know sort of where I come from. So I somehow wound up after having a pretty good life here in the West, back in school, where I did my PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology. And the summers were great. I was in waders all summer, but then the winters I was pipetting all the time because I was using DNA sequencing to do this ecology and evolutionary biology stuff. And while I was pipetting away, decided I never wanted to see a pipetter again in my life. And two, I was working, on a lot of sort of, I'm not gonna say arcane, but science. And I think I had got into that program thinking science was all we needed in the world was more science, and then all our problems would be solved. And by the time I was done, I realized, oh boy, I had been a little bit naive. So and I also kept thinking about how, Colorado, where I had grown up and fishing, and how I wanted to return here. And let's see, can you flip forward? So what kept going through my mind about fishing was that we all think of fishing. I don't know if I speak for all of you, but I certainly always think of fishing as this escape from industrialization and technology and my cell phone and all of that stuff, right? And it's this beautiful spiritual return to nature. And being the sort of contrarian personality that I am, I decided I needed to puncture that balloon a little bit. And so I got this grant from the National Science Foundation to come out here to see you and work on this book. You can skip forward. That's just to show you, those are couple of my kids out fishing. We love to fish, but there are some problems with it. So skip ahead. Okay, so I came out here to write this book about fisheries management and how that had been conducted in the United States, but the world, but mostly the United States. And quickly, the book project became a book about rainbow trout. Because as you can see, this is from 2004, and I would actually be curious, this was a lot of work making this graph. I had to go to every state agency and get their data, and it's all in different formats. Anyway, rainbow trout are the far and away the most commonly stocked fish in America. We stock 100 million rainbow, in 2004, we stocked 100 million rainbow trout, and that's catchable size rainbow trout. So that's enough rainbow trout. If we put them head to tail, we could put them up and down the Mississippi on both sides, both banks, Columbia, the Colorado, and the Connecticut, and we'd still have some left over. Okay, that's how many fish we stock every year in the United States. So it quickly became a book about rainbow trout. So these fish they're not just here in the United States, they are everywhere in the world now. We've got the United States, you can catch them in Hawaii if you want to go to Hawaii, they stock them there. They're in every continent in the world except for Antarctica. We might get there soon, I'm not sure. But many of you may know, there's famous rainbow trout fisheries down here in South America. South Africa is huge, New Zealand, so they are everywhere. I guess, that's my brother. Okay, so skip ahead. Okay, so not only are these fish everywhere, but they are culturally everywhere too. So these are just some examples. These are stamps. There's New Zealand, Oman, that's somewhere in South Africa, Malawi. These rainbow trout are a cultural phenomenon. They're everywhere. You can find them you can buy mailboxes of rainbow trout, oven mitts, staplers, whatever it is rainbow trout. That is the world's fish, okay? Everywhere. Go ahead. Okay. And so we get even more into the industrialization of these fish. So these fish are being raised in hatcheries, and this is an article from the Wall Street Journal from 1996. And these fish, you guys can't see over there. These fish were being raised in these hatcheries, and they feed them with these pellets. They just chuck these pellets out into the raceways for the fish. And the fish had completely forgotten. They didn't pick up what their job was, right? So they were stocking these fish, and they realized they weren't taking the bait, they weren't taking the fly, because they were looking for pellets the whole time. So they actually had to, before they stocked the fish, they had to teach them how to eat worms or eat flies. So they had to teach them ahead of time. Although, now here's an interesting one that I just stuck in here, skip ahead. I had not seen this before, and somehow I showed it. I don't know what that says about my feed, but on eBay now you can buy a fly that looks like a pellet from the hatchery. Okay, so that's sort of where we are today. Okay, I can keep going. Okay, this is getting excessive, right? This is a triploid rainbow that is the largest rainbow trout ever caught. It's 43 pounds. They caught it up in Canada and like fifth mocker. Triploid means, so they've heat shocked the eggs, so they have more chromosomes than they should. And so they don't put any effort into reproduction and they put all their effort into weight. So there's the world records rainbow trout. There was a big controversy, interestingly, about whether it should be recognized as the world record rainbow trout because it had been heat shocked and it escaped from a fish farm. But hopefully, like, by the end, you'll say, well, I don't know whether that's legit or not, because all of these rainbow trout have been manipulated. This one, University of Missouri, they're feeding these fish creatine, which is, bodybuilding supplement. And literally, they think people will pay more to get a fish that fights harder, right? I mean, that's the whole point. This one is genetically modified, and I don't know how much I want to talk about it, but that is not what a fish should look like. All it builds is muscle. All right, let's skip ahead. Okay, so rainbow trout, where are they from? Native only to the Pacific Rim, from depending on what you call a rainbow trout, northern Mexico, up all the way around through to Kamchatka. So that's where rainbow trout are actually from, and I just showed you the map of where they are now. Go ahead and skip ahead. So just for the record, I haven't given this talk for 10 years, so you'll have to forgive me if I get a little distracted. Okay, so the story. So how do we get to this place? Now I've got you set up, right, with these fish, this crazy system we have. How do we get there? That's going to be sort of what the rest of the talk is about. So the first place I like to talk is with this guy, who's Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., who, as you may know, is Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. was the famous Supreme Court Justice. And his father was a famous columnist for the Atlantic, and also he may have helped start the Atlantic. And so what we had going on was, after the before we had industrialization going on up and down the East Coast, and as a result, we were using our rivers as sewers. We were cutting down all the trees. We were building dams to power the mills, and let me get to that in a minute. That comes a little bit, but the industrialization was creating vast amounts of wealth for a small segment of society, the Anglo-Saxons of the world, who were controlling it in places like New York City and Boston, which is where he was from. And these people became concerned looking at their kids, and I always think of this because I have kids now, and I also become concerned seeing them sitting on their screens, and like I get worried about them not being outside enough. Just in case any of you also have that worry, let me just quote you from Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. way back in the middle of the 19th century. He said, "Never have such a set of black-coated, stiff-jointed, soft-muscled, paste-complexioned youth as we can boast in our Atlantic cities, never before sprang from the loins of Anglo-Saxon lineage." So they were worried about the same thing a 175 years ago. But we are now, if that makes you feel okay. Okay, so what are we going to do about that? Well, this guy, so the next really interesting character in this story is George Perkins Marsh. So he's considered one of the founders of the environmental movement in the United States. He wrote a book called Man and Nature in 1864. That was the first book to really look at the way humans were impacting the natural world. Also, in addition to being the first environmental person in the United States, he wrote a biography of the camel. He wrote the first Icelandic English dictionary. He was Lincoln's ambassador to Italy. And the list could go on. But he was one of the most interesting people in the whole wide world. And in addition, he wrote a report for the state of Vermont in 1857. They were worried because all their fish were disappearing. So they said to him, "Will you please write us a report about what we should do about this?" And I'm going to read you a quote from him too, if I can find it, because what he said in his report was, "We have notoriously less physical hardihood and endurance than the generation which preceded our own. Our habits are those of less bodily activity, the sports of the field, and the athletic games. And we have become not merely a more thoughtful and earnest, but it is to be feared a duller, as well as a more effeminate and less bold and spirited nation." Okay, so big fear. And not only that, But democracy itself relies on having virile men. If we don't have virile men out there, democracy is, America doesn't have virile men, America's democracy is gonna fall. So what do they do about that? Gotta get them out in the field, hunting and fishing again. Hunting, no can do, because we're never gonna bring big game animals back. But fishing, we can do, because just about 15 years earlier, a couple of French guys had invented this technique for artificially propagating fish, artificially spawning fish. Reinvented this technique. And it had begun to, he had gotten onto that, and he said, here's what we have to do. We have to artificially spawn these fish, artificially propagate fish in hatcheries. Stock them into these rivers that are completely, interestingly, I told you he's the first environmentalist. He said, there's nothing we can do about the root cause of the problem. Factories, the dams, the logging. But we have a technological fix. We can just stock these fish into the rivers. The boys will go fishing again. Democracy is saved. So, there you go, easy, easy peasy. Okay, that gets sort of put on hold for the Civil War. But then after the Civil War, another really fascinating character in American history, that's Spencer Fullerton Baird. He was the assistant secretary at the Smithsonian Institution, I think. And he had a tremendous, incredible, fascinating naturalist. So, and he somehow convinced Congress to appropriate funds for a 1-year temporary commission that would look at the reason that this scud, which is a marine fish, were declining in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And he goes out and does this study, and he says, oh, well, it's all those fish traps you have in the estuaries, you gotta get rid of those, and if you don't, the federal government's gonna step in. The states laugh him out of the water because they say there's no way the federal government's gonna step in, and they were right. And in addition, there was a scud baby boom like the next year, so his study is just gone. But he's an incredibly, in addition to being an incredible scientist, he's a really politically savvy guy. So he figures out that there's, or I guess some other people come to him, who are the American Fish Culturists Association. And they have been privately raising fish in hatcheries for sale to restaurants in New York and things like that. And they say, we've got to get the federal government involved in doing this fish culture stuff and dumping these fish in the stream so people will go fishing. And so he recognizes that that could be a great way to extend the life of his fish commission. And so he jumps on with both feet. And by the way, he was right, because that fish commission has become the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, so it's still here. So he jumps in with both feet, and within a year or two, it's all about raising fish. It's spreading them all over the country. So go ahead and skip forward. Okay, so this, sorry you guys over here. This is a picture of, that's an unfinished Washington Monument, still getting finished, I think. Didn't they start with Colorado marble and then go to Vermont marble? No one knows. If you look at the Washington Monument, the Colorado marble got dissed somehow. I think Vermont took over. Anyway, there's two different colors. Anyway, okay, so here's the Washington Monument going up. Here is a wagon with a horse, and these hands on the back are holding fish. And if you ever actually look at a map of Washington, D.C., you'll see that the Washington Monument is a little bit off center. It's not quite where you think it would be, as a cross between Lincoln Memorial, Capitol, White House, Jefferson, because that was all an estuary. There was a pond there, and that pond became the national fish raising pond. And the U.S. Fish Commission used it to raise fish. And so these are egg hatching jars that they're doing there on the mall in Washington, D.C. And they would raise these fish, usually they're not uncatchables yet, they're just little fry or eggs. And then they would distribute them. So go ahead and skip it. So the way this would work, and this was all Baird's idea, was, and this is how politically savvy he was. If you wanted fish for your rivers, like Boulder Flycasters wanted to stock some fish here in Boulder Creek, you'd have to contact your congressperson and tell them, and then that message would get through to Baird. And so he wanted the message to Congress to know how important his work was, right? So you couldn't go straight to the Fish Commission. But what you would do is you tell them, we'd like some fish to stock in Boulder Creek. And so they would say, okay, and they would say, okay, and then, you know, a few days before they were gonna arrive, they'd telegraph you and say, we're coming, and you meet them with your milk cans here at the railroad siding. They'd pour their fry into yours, you'd go out to your creek and dump them in, and now voila, you have all sorts of fish in your rivers. So that is how we sort of get started, sending fish all over the country. And this was not just fish, this was a big idea, a big ideal back then. So they called it acclimatizing, and it was, you know, the age of colonialism, and the idea was to, yeah.
What was originally, what kind of fish were they stocking? Because it wasn't probably rainbow.
No, it was not rainbows yet.
So what were they stocking?
A lot of the fish that they were trying to stock back then, that's a good question. This is all actually probably rainbow end, but they also did carp, a lot of carp. That was a big idea to get it around to all the fish. Farms, because they thought that'd be a great source of protein for everybody. So there a lot of different fish, but yeah. So they keep going with this, and sorry, what was I about? Oh, acclimatizing. Worldwide concept that we want to spread all of these species all over the world. And in terms of fish, it was, quote, let the best fish like the best man win. So just, you know, stock them, see what happens, let the best fish win. Who cares? And starlings, you know, starlings, they're all around Boulder now, I'm sure. Those were part of this movement. A guy named Eugene Shiflin, who was a drug, like a pharmacy magnate, in New York, decided that America was going to be impoverished if we didn't have all of the birds that were mentioned in Shakespeare. So in Henry V, there's one line about a starling, and so he brought starlings over from Europe and introduced them to the United Central Park in the United States. Now you can find starlings everywhere, and they come because they're mentioned in Henry V. So this was a worldwide movement. It wasn't just these fish. Okay. So now this guy, I got really interested in him while I was working on this. This is Livingston Stone, and he was a minister, traced his forefathers back to the Mayflower in Charlestown, New Hampshire, which is a mill town on the Connecticut River. And he somehow got fascinated by fish culture. He was supposed to be a minister, but he kept raising fish in these little ponds, and he finally got so fascinated he quit being a minister and became a fish culturalist full-time. And he went down to Spencer Fullerton Baird, and he said, and one of the biggest ones that they really, really wanted, they destroyed the salmon runs up and down the East Coast, right? And they wanted those Atlantic salmon back. And so he said, let's go to California and get some of those Pacific salmon, and we'll bring them back and stock them up and down the East Coast. We'll have salmon runs. So this is about 1872. That's right when they completed the transcontinental railroad, right? And Baird buys into this idea. He says, okay, let's do it. So this guy is this minister from New Hampshire, never been out of New Hampshire before, gets on the train, heads out to California, takes him a week to cross the continent, must have been amazing, and winds up in Sacramento. And he says, hey, you know, I'm here to collect some salmon because we need some back east. And all the people in Sacramento are like, what? There's no salmon here. They died out forever ago, because in California, they've been doing all this placer mining. And placer mining is, you know, is where they take those giant fire hoses and hose down the banks. So all that sediment is washing into the Sacramento River and raising the level of the bed by like 6 feet per year at one point. That's how bad it is. So there were no fish in Sacramento. Finally, he meets some guy who says, you know, I think I saw some Indians spearing fish way up north. So he heads out on the railroad, then on the stagecoach, then on foot, and gets to the McCloud River, which is up north right by Mount Shasta. And he starts walking along, and sure enough, eventually sees a bunch of salmon, a bunch of fish hanging out on bushes that were drying. These are the Wintu Indians that lived up there. Most of the Indians had been terribly treated and were not really around, but the Wintu had managed to hang on to some of their land. And somehow he convinces them to let him stick around and build a fish hatchery there on the McCloud River. And he starts raising these Pacific salmon. This is just a picture of, they said the stagecoach was held up every week. I mean, it was truly a wild place up there. Somebody convinces him to let him stick around and build a hatchery, and he does, and he raises the Pacific salmon for, I forgot, 5 years or so. Keeps sending them back east on the railroad. Yeah, still to this day, we don't have a single run of Pacific salmon on the East Coast. And failure. So go back to Spencer Fulton Baird, who is the politically savvy guy who's he doesn't want the money to run out for the US Fish Commission. So what are they gonna do? So Baird realizes he's in touch with another guy, Seth Green, who's a fish culturalist in Michigan. And Seth Green has been sending brook trout out to California to a group called the California Piscatorial and Ornithological Acclimatizing Society. And so because they wanted the East Coast fish, but they'd also been playing around with some of their trout. So they'd sent Green a few rainbow trout. And Green says, I think these are pretty good fish. They're easy to raise in the hatchery. They fight well when they're caught. They can stand degraded conditions pretty well. So Baird says, okay, well, let's try that. So Stone moves upriver about 4 miles and establishes a rainbow trout hatchery. And that's the end of it. That's that. Go ahead. Let's see, there's Stone. One of these is his nephew, and then one of these is his other worker, and that's their hatchery on the McLeod. And this hatchery is it's still there, but it's under Lake Shasta now. So when there was a huge drought like 10 years ago, someone emailed me and I wish I could have gone, but said you gotta come because you can actually see the pilings that are left from this fish hatchery on Lake Shasta. But anyway, they spread these fish everywhere using those fish trains. 33 out of 38 states within a year or two had rainbow trout. I think, yeah, this one's in Leadville. So they're raising the rainbow trout elsewhere. They're stocking them everywhere. They're spreading them everywhere. And the goal is to naturalize rainbow trout all over the country, and of course, have man and state democracy. All right, let's get forward. Sorry. Yeah, okay.
You did good.
Okay, so then. Here our story, we flash forward a little ways now. And some accountant begins thinking about this thing that they're doing, and I'm mocking accountants, I hope there's no accountants in there. But began looking at this thing that we were doing, spreading this fish around, and at some point we'd spread the fry everywhere, and wherever these fish were gonna get naturalized, they had been naturalized. But somebody figured out that, hey, from an economic standpoint, we want to maximize the return to creel. So we should be the lowest price per fish returned to creel, per fish caught. That should be our goal, right? That makes sense from an economic standpoint. These guys are out here to catch fish. Let's make it the fish as cheap as possible. So what they realize is that it's a lot cheaper to actually raise the fish to hatchery size, 8 to 10 inches, in the hatcheries, and then stock them out in the rivers. So they start going that route, and it becomes, they take it to the extreme, because we always take things to the extreme here, right? So I'm going to read you a quote that a California fish commissioner wrote that he describes as more or less true story. Okay, I don't know what to make of it. He wrote, take for example a sunny Sunday morning in May. Mr. Los Angeles looks out of his window and for no good reason at all discovers that there has been a cloudburst on the desert the night before and there's water in the Los Angeles River. By 9:30 o'clock, 20,000 telephone calls have come to the Fish and Game Commission to come out and plant some fish because there's water in the Los Angeles River. Since we have one of the most efficient departments in the country, by 10 o'clock a truckload has started out. We carry a siren on the trucks, by which at the end of planting, we let everybody know that the planting has been accomplished. By 11 o'clock, the fish are caught out of the stream, and at noon, the river is dried up again. All right, so that's where we get to. Okay, so that's you guys all know this story. So let's skip forward. Okay, so now flash forward again. The year is 1962. Here we have Wyoming. The Green River is this basically a quarter of, well, I guess not quite a quarter, but this watershed here, huge watershed in Wyoming. Goes down here to what is now Flaming Gorge Reservoir. Up here is Fontenelle Reservoir. Big watershed. And full of these fish that are not trout. They're full of pike minnows, razorback suckers, bonytails, chub. Okay, and those, they say, and Bureau of Reclamation has just decided to build this Flaming Gorge Reservoir here and Fontenelle up here. And that's gonna take this river that one that before it was dammed would be a massive flood in the spring when all the snowmelt occurred, full of sediment. And then by late August, just this trickle. And thanks to these dams, there's gonna be a cold, clear water stream year round. So the Wyoming Game and Fish, Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Utah Fish and Game Department decide what we're gonna do is we're gonna poison out all of those trash fish, those native fish, those suckers and stuff, so that we can introduce rainbow trout. Okay, and then we're gonna have a fisherman's paradise. So when I got onto this story, being the naive person that I am, I thought, well, I'm just gonna go to the Denver Post. I scrolled through all the microfilm in the Denver Public Library. All the microfilm looking for stories from that date in 1962 about this project. I could not find a single story about it. And I mean, can you imagine if we poisoned the entire Green River today? Like, there would probably be a front page story about it. Not a single thing. So I go back and I start really getting into the depths, and finally I get into, I don't know if it's the sports pages or something. And they talk about how great the fishing is gonna be in the Green River once this project is accomplished. That's it. Awesome. No controversy whatsoever about poisoning out all those fish. And so, cause they thought about coarse fish or trash fish and game fish. That was the worldview, that was the dichotomy in their brains. There were a couple of people, Robert Miller and Carl Hubbs, who were fish biologists. I think Robert Miller's son was a professor at CU for a while. It may still be there. Anyway, they were the only ones, because they had been traveling around collecting native fish. They were fascinated by native small fish. And they tried to raise a stink about this. They went to the Sierra Club. They wrote op-eds for newspapers. They went to every organization they could to try to get them to say, hey, this is bad. We're wiping out these native fish for the sake of this non-native fish. Why are we doing this? They couldn't get any traction whatsoever. Nobody paid them any regard. Okay. So project goes ahead as planned. So that's Flaming Gorge, by the way, and that's basically. Okay, go ahead. Okay, here's the Empire and Suburban News, where I finally found the story about how awesome the fishing was going to be. And that's Robert Rushmiller. Okay, let's skip ahead. Okay, so the way to wipe out a river, if that's your agenda, is to use rotenone. Rotenone is this pesticide that comes from a plant in South America. It's what they use in the what is that? Not the killer from the Green Lagoon. You know the famous old movie Creature from the Black Lagoon, right? That's what they use to drive the creature from the Black Lagoon out of the Black Lagoon. So it kills fish, and it causes cellular respiration to cease, so they just die. So what you do is you go up and down the Green River and you put these hoses across the extent of the river every 10 miles. And then you get these tanks, these barrels full of rotenone, and you start at the top. These are guys just installing the system. And you start at the top and you start dripping this rotenone into the river. And then once that front of rotenone gets to you, you're 10 miles downstream, let's say, you turn your tap on. So it's this front of rotenone that moves downstream. Go ahead. So you can see the rotenone, it turns the river sort of milky white. So they're starting the project here, and they're running the rotenone downstream. And here's some folks. So the milky color is the rotenone. This guy has found a dead fish. He's going to bring that home for dinner because they invited them to bring that stuff home for dinner. And at this kind of, there's a lot of discussion these days about the use of rotenone. They do use rotenone now to mimic, not necessarily cause, but mimic Parkinson's disease symptoms in rats. So I would not be eating that fish. But back then, Okay, so off they go. They are on the project. They have helicopters to get any little, ponds or beds around that can get hit by the main front of Rotenone. There's this massive front of Rotenone, and the fish, apparently they say in front, was just, you can imagine tens and tens of thousands of fish trying to escape the Rotenone and moving downstream. Go ahead. Dead fish everywhere. Here's some more people out collecting dead fish for dinner. So they are, I forgot to mention, so Bureau of Reclamation was, their idea was, well, the Rotenone will stop at the dam, at the Flaming Gorge Dam. But Bureau of Reclamation didn't finish the dam on time, and so the gates were still open, and the river was still flowing. And they said to them, well, we have to get this thing done. Bureau Rec wasn't gonna finish closing the gates until November or something, at which point the water would be too cold for the Rotenone to be effective. So they said, we have to get this project done while it's warm. So what we'll do, go ahead, is we'll go to this bridge, which is right in here in Browns Park in Colorado, so just over the border from Utah. I mean, beautiful place, Browns Park. We'll go to this bridge, and this bridge is still there. And what we'll do is we'll spread this oxidizing agent, potassium permanganate, that will take care of that Rotenone, no longer be toxic. And then problem solved. The fish kill will stop right there in Browns Park. So here's some guys with their spreaders and their goggles on so the stuff doesn't get in their eyes. And they're in charge of spreading the potassium permanganate off the bridge to stop the Rotenone from getting any further downstream. The best way to know whether toxic Rotenone is getting downstream is to have sentinel fish. So that's a fish in a cage. And this guy is just down below the bridge here, okay? And he's checking the fish every so often to say whether the fish is alive and well or not alive. And if it's not alive and well, he yells up, or he probably walkie-talkies up the bridge and says, more potassium permanganate. Okay, and so the problem is, huge storm, cold front comes in, huge storm, wind whipping around, snow whipping around, and they ran out of potassium permanganate. Okay, so, dead fish end up, dinosaurs only about 16, Dinosaur National Monument's only about 16 miles downstream. Dead fish wind up in Dinosaur National Monument. And bang, all of a sudden, that's a problem. Wasn't a problem. Nobody thought about anything of this beforehand. Bang. So for two reasons. One, dinosaur had become, David Brower and the Sierra Club had been fighting against the Bureau of Reclamation to block them from building a dam in Dinosaur. And they waged this brilliant PR campaign to convince people that Dinosaur was our national cathedral. Europe has cathedrals, we have places like Dinosaur. So they convinced America, and so they stopped the dam, and actually won the fight. And otherwise, Dinosaur would be a lake or reservoir right now. They won that fight by convincing Americans to care about Dinosaur. And second of all, 1962 was Rachel Spring. And Rachel Carson, Silent Spring. So Rachel Carson wrote this book, Silent Spring, that was, I don't think we all can fathom it now, but it was transformative in American culture about how chemicals and industry were affecting wildlife or nature. And everyone was enraptured by that book. And so all of a sudden you have these toxins, these poisons, killing our native animals in our cathedral. And it becomes all of a sudden what had never been a controversy before. They had done lots of operations like this, became a controversy. So go ahead. Stuart Udall was the Secretary of Interior at the time under Kennedy. And just as a side note, I once managed to have lunch with Stuart Udall sitting across from James Watt. Remember, Watt was Reagan's Interior Secretary. Watt was trying to be very accommodating to Stuart Udall, very nice to him. Udall wanted nothing to do with James Watt. He was blistering. Anyway, it was an interesting lunch. Okay, anyway, Udall is head of Interior, so he's now got Park Service going head to head with Fish and Wildlife Service, because Fish and Wildlife Service had sponsored this operation and helped run it. The Park Service runs Dinosaur National Monument. And so it comes to he has to settle this thing. And so he creates this thing called the Committee on Rare and Endangered Wildlife Species. And he says when he creates that committee that from now on, I've forgotten the quote, I could probably pull it out of my book, but basically concern about native species has to be a priority whenever we evaluate whether we're gonna do one of these projects. And that, you can follow the line right down, 66, we get the Endangered Species Preservation Act, 69, Endangered Species Conservation Act, and finally 73, the Endangered Species Act that we have enforced today. So this is a little bit simplified, folks, but it's a good story. From that operation on the Green River, we get the 1973 Endangered Species Act. Okay, so talk about unintended consequences, right? Okay, flashing forward again. So this is the Sierras, and if you have not been up to some of these lakes, the Sierras yet, you should get there because it is one of the most gorgeous places in the world. But these lakes were fishless, most of them, because after the ice receded 10, 12,000 years ago, the fish couldn't get up, too steep, too many waterfalls. So this whole ecosystem developed up there. And you had these fishless, beautiful fishless lakes. I'm getting ahead of my story. You had these lakes, but they were fishless. And that's bad. Because fish are good. So John Muir, you know, the famous other conservationist who convinced Teddy Roosevelt to do all sorts of things, was friends with Livingston Stone, or he had visited Livingston Stone at the hatchery. And John Muir also thought it was, interestingly, John Muir thought it was a waste for these lakes not to have fish. So he said, we've got to get fish out there. So they started hauling them in on backpacks or on mules and dumping into these lakes and getting fish into the Sierra Lakes. Now, flash forward to post-World War II. This is a guy named Carol Feist who I met, who was a bomber pilot in World War II. And they come home from the war, these pilots, and there's all these surplus aircraft. This, I think, is a sub Hunter. I've forgotten what kind of plane that is. I'm not sure if anyone else knows. But they have all this surplus aircraft, and all of these expert pilots were really good at dropping things out of planes. And so what these guys say is, well, we can, forget these donkeys and mules and backpacks. We can do this a lot more efficiently. So they decide to try dropping fish out of planes. The first thing they do, they take this milk can, they fly over the hatchery, and they throw the whole milk can out the window, and they're aiming for the pond. They miss, bounces along the concrete. They land the plane, run over to the fish can, and the fish are still alive. So this is awesome. They do another test where they try grab a fish, hold it up in their hand while they gun a pickup truck down the hatchery driveway for a couple minutes, and then put it back. The fish is still alive. So they're like, we can do this. So they cut holes in the bottom of the plane and start dropping fish out of the plane. Here they are, dropping fish over the lakes, and that is their full-time job all day, all year round. They're dropping fish out of planes into these lakes. And they still, of course, I'm sure you all know, they still do this all over the country and all over the world.
And have a fly fishing joke about it.
Right, fishing fly. That's good. Apparently, it's somewhat unpleasant for the fish. I was talking to this guy who actually wanted to see what happened to the fish, so he was snorkeling one of these lakes. He said, "Drop them right out and see what happens." So they did, and he said like half of them ripped in half on impact. The other 40% went. The other half went to the bottom, just because they're airborne, and 10% of them maybe survived these swimming. So anyway, not that pleasant for the fish apparently, but still it gets the fish out there. Okay. Oh, they do it with beaver too. If you look on YouTube, you can find this. They dropped this beaver using a parachute. They started dropping beavers out of planes. That's excessive. Okay. This is the guy who he had the fish dropped on his head while he was snorkeling, and he was up there in these lakes in the Sierra, and he was one of the problems up there was that these frogs, the mountain yellow-legged frogs, were declining precipitously, to endangered status. And his suspicion was the fish might have something to do with it. So he got permission from California to remove the fish from about 4 or 5 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 experimental lakes. He had to do it with drift nets because, interestingly, California does not allow rope note anymore because they're so, California is pretty extreme on chemical stuff. So he had to use it with drift nets and caught the fish out of these lakes. And what he found was, I mean, surprise, surprise, the aquatic invertebrates exploded once you took the fish out of the lakes. And I'm getting ahead of my story. Also, the frogs came bouncing back because the tadpoles weren't being eaten by the fish. But it wasn't just the frogs, it was also the aquatic invertebrates. And the aquatic invertebrates are great, but even more importantly, they're food for the great grand rosy finch and the bats. So the whole ecosystem is getting affected by these fish that have been stocked into these lakes. So as a result of that, California stopped. They actually just stopped stocking those high Sierra lakes with planes or at all anymore. And there's still plenty of self-sustaining populations up there, but they had to really back off. It's, you know, it's a more complex story than that. There's a chytrid fungus that was wiping out amphibians all over the world, and it was getting to these guys too. So I'm telling you a simple ecological parable, but the reality actually is quite complex, but you got the picture. Okay, good. Okay, so here they are. They stopped. And here he is drift netting. That's not rolling now, that's one of his field systems. Drift netting the fish out of those lakes. And I guess I'll go back to the beginning, and I'm not sure whether I said this already, but this is the story actually that got me really interested in working on this book. Because it became apparent to me while I was working on my PhD that science was frequently, I thought people used the science to arrive at their decision, right? And it became apparent to me at some point in my life, my naive life, that actually people arrive at their preconceived opinion and then they cherry pick the science to justify it. And that's what happened here. The anglers said, you know what's killing all those frogs? It's the pesticide drift from the Central Valley. And they could find studies, you know, if you put pesticides in a tank with tadpoles, they die. So they were like, look, that's what the problem is. And the agricultural folks were like, no, that's not what's causing the frogs to die, it's the fish that you're stocking. And they could cite all sorts of examples as well. So that dispute is really what got me interested in this, because it really does say so much about what science is used and how we use it and how science and society works today. Okay, let's skip forward. How much time do we have here? 7:26. I am definitely going late. I'll just add that one of the big problems with rainbow trout is that they hybridize. It's not just that they outcompete other species or eat other species, it's that they hybridize with the cutthroat because they're so closely related. And so you end up with these real conundrums. So here's an example when I was in Montana on the Flathead and saw this sign and I was fishing and it says, you catch the rainbows and get rid of them. If you catch a rainbow, kill it. If you catch a native cutthroat, West Slope cutthroat, put it back. So go ahead. So that's what I caught. And that, I don't know if you can tell, but that's definitely a hybrid between a rainbow and a cutthroat. You can see the cutthroat, but also the spotting pattern is rainbow. So what am I supposed to do now? And this is the central conundrum that they face here. I'm sort of joking, but whether or not they should describe West Slope, this was 20 years ago, should call West Slope cutthroat an endangered species. Well, that depends on what you call a West Slope cutthroat. If there's one, so the rainbows in the West and the West Slope cutthroats are interbreeding. If that cutthroat has 1% rainbow genes and it's 99% West Slope cutthroat, is it a West Slope cutthroat or not? Or 20%? Where do we draw the line? Or does it have to be absolutely pure? And at that point, why are we so obsessed with purity? Why does that matter? And so it became a real conundrum about what to do with the West Slope cutthroat. And it's the same thing that happens all over the place. And it's not just a matter of values, but it's also a matter of the fact that, so if you look at this map, there's the Flathead. And let me see, the black dots are hybridized populations with rainbows. The white ones are purebred West Slope cutthroat. You see how they're all at the top headwaters of these little tributaries? So the genes, the rainbow genes are basically almost moving independently. The hybrid fish are moving upstream, spreading, sending their genes out here. The only populations we have left are these tiny headwater creeks. But you have to imagine that there's a different set of West Slope genes that were adapted to these main stem conditions, right? That are very different. And so what do we do if the only place that we have west slope teams that are adapted to the main stem are in hybridized fish, then are those hybrid fish a savior for those genes, or are they the biggest threat to the west slope cutthroat that we have? So it's just the conundrums that we face in this sort of thing are fantastic and difficult. Go ahead. Okay, so I'm gonna finish that, it's a bit late. I will say two things, because one, people sometimes think maybe I'm just 100% opposed to rainbow trout. I don't think, we're here. We're here where we are. Rainbow trout are not going away, they are here, they are gonna be here. Yes, I do support restoring native fish where we can, where it's practical, absolutely. In some ways, just from a selfish standpoint, because I really like to catch native fish, and I also think it makes fishing much more interesting to me personally. And I would imagine you could sell that, like you can catch rainbow trout anywhere, Pennsylvania, Hawaii. But there's only one place you can catch a greenback cutthroat, right? So I would imagine from an economic standpoint, it could be something from an ecological standpoint. Okay, you got my picture there. The only other thing I would add is that it might seem like I was making fun of those folks back then at the beginning who were transporting rainbow trout all around, but I will say that when I was working on this book, the rhetoric that I read from what they were saying, they believed they were doing the right thing for the world. They were 100% sure they were doing the right thing for the world. And it's very similar to the rhetoric that we people have today about restoring natives. 100% sure they're doing the right thing for the world. And I wonder what they're gonna say in 50 or 100 years about all of them. Okay, done.
Okay.
Question?
Thank you.
Earlier in the presentation, we had a world map.
Yeah.
Showed all the countries that have
Yeah,
drought.
yeah.
Do all those countries have hatcheries?
That's an interesting question. Don't know. Don't know if they're just naturalized or if they're all doing hatcheries. You know where it is? Don't know. So answer to your question, I don't know, but interesting aside, one of the biggest places now for rainbow trout, raising rainbow trout in hatcheries and putting them in strains is China. Because they're facing the same phenomenon we face in massive industrialization. Yearning, nostalgia for the rural life, which actually wasn't that great, but now there's yearning for it. So get the folks out there fishing for trout again, which I think is a huge place for that. Yeah,
Where did they get the funding for the Green River Rehabilitation Project?
most of it was federal, so the Fish and Wildlife Service was the one who came in.
And it's just hard for me to comprehend how you can justify funding a project that kills all native fish.
Right, that's what's crazy, so you have to conceive of having a worldview where you don't even think that concept of native versus non-native doesn't even cross your mind. You're focused on trash versus game fish. And yeah, it's interesting to think how that shift could occur, yeah.
Was one of the reasons, I mean, you referenced it earlier with like trying to get you more involved in the outdoors. Was one of the main reasons for funding that project to try and reach more youth, to get them outdoors, so the fish that they would be fighting would be more.
I don't know about youth, I don't know if they were still under the virility thing, then although of course they were, but definitely from an economic standpoint, they looked at it and said, this will draw in, I don't know how many $1 million a year to the economy, to these small towns in Wyoming. So definitely from a tourism economic standpoint, yes, you better believe they did those numbers, yeah, and they still do. Yeah.
There used to be a hatchery in Boulder.
Yep.
Do you remember that?
So there's one right above the library.
Right.
Okay, this one was like Folsom and was it Unity Church?
No, I haven't been down there.
That's the old.
Yeah.
Changed.
Yeah,
What years ago?
is he, and it's gone now?
Oh, long gone, yeah.
Yeah. But what, is the one above the library still there?
Yes,
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah, it's just a couple blocks up
It
the
is.
hill from the
Right
library.
across the street. Yes, two
Little-
blocks.
Little hatchery, right in the middle of
Is that
that.
rainbow then?
I don't know what they're raising there.
That's what I'm-
No. You have to go fish, you have to go catch some. Anything else? Yeah.
You know, your research, you mentioned like bureaus that recommendation, wildlife service, all wildlife service.
Yep, yeah. They were definitely in conflict, because Fish and Wildlife Service had funded the project. Park Service ran Dinosaur, And so these dead fish wind up in their national park and they say, hey, this is not cool, this is a national park, right? And it's unclear whether those fish died in the park or were they died upstream and then washed down into the park. So that's a little unclear. Either way, it was a moot point. Anything else? All right, well, thanks.
Thanks again.
Right, folks, we have a few more housekeeping items here before I cut you loose. So, our March meeting is our celebrity speaker. This is a pretty cool one. We have Ron Balak, who is an author and photographer and obviously fly fisherman. He spends most of his life fishing alpine lakes in Colorado and has several books on the matter and will be presenting about it. This should be a really cool event if you're one of those people who likes getting out into the alpine to target fish. This is the speaker for you. I'm really excited about it. Stephen, do we have anything else to add to that?
Excuse me, I'm getting over some bug here, but so yeah, this is, last year we had Pat Dorsey, for those of you who were able to get there. Ron's name may not be as big as Pat's, but Ron is really well known as a backcountry angler. He's been to over 600 lakes in the Rocky Mountains, been around the world, a couple of books, as Alex said. We're going to be at Twisted Pine for this one. Trying to find a space. You can see here, we maxed out. So, we normally get about 80 to 100 people to show up to these things. So we'll be at Twisted Pine on Thursday, March 6th. We just got all this nailed down. Long story of speakers that we had who canceled, and DJs over in Louisville that we used last year is closed because of a water break, and everything that could go wrong went wrong. So we finally got this nailed down. We're going to be promoting it. Tickets will be on sale here shortly on the TU My Event Center. So what they call Event Groove on the TU website. There'll be walk-ups as well. We'll have a buffet food option as it's not a restaurant, and trying to serve 80 people from a 3-man kitchen in the Twisted Pine didn't look like a good idea. So we're going to have a ticket that'll get you into the food buffet. And we're really excited about having Ron with us. He's a great guy. He's speaking at the end of the month at the fly fishing show. And he is a big supporter of Trout Unlimited and does this for our chapters all over the state. So we're really excited to have him. And we'll have door prizes as last year. And we'll have a grand prize yet to be determined. We're still working on that one. Like I say, everything took a little longer to come together this year. But thank you. And we look forward to having you there in March. And then
our April meeting is going to be James Parker, the owner of Arbor Anglers over in Lafayette. And that will be here at Upslope. Talking. Sorry, that's not big. All right, additional. He'll be talking about fishing the big hops. Additional upcoming events, as Stephen just mentioned, the fly fishing show is coming to Denver, February 21st to 23rd. It's a pretty cool event for those of you who haven't been. It's vendors and professionals from the whole industry. Lots of cool stuff to see and do. We have the CTU Stewardship Gala on March 13th at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. I believe we'll have a table there.
we have a BFC table, and tickets and everything beyond that are on the CTU website.
Should be a good
Probably
one.
also Event Groove.
Let's check that out. And then lastly, we have the TU Western Regional Rendezvous in Utah, March 28th and 29th.
And if you've never been to any of the regional rendezvous, I've been to several. Unfortunately, I won't make this one this year. In combination with this, there's a big fly fishing show going on at the same time that they put them together. Great education sessions, learning about what Trout Unlimited is doing in the West. It's really focused. Trout Unlimited now does them. We used to be a national one. Now they're split by region. Last year was in Idaho. We fished on the Snake, the day before the conference in, Idaho Falls. If you know Sandy, Utah, you know there is good fishing in Sandy, Utah. So great opportunity if you have a chance to take that, take that in.
More info, sorry.
Sorry.
One last thing.
More, oh, go ahead, Don.
Oh, you have one last.
I was just gonna point out the calendar link, if you want more info on any of that.
Anders brought some copies of his book. Check it out on your way out.
There you are.
And
Trying. I think I went too many times.
there,
Thank you and have a good night.
feel free to hang out. We have the room.